Okay. I don't know how far into this I want to get. Let's go ahead and finish off the written account of Adam's line. The account of Noah begins in Genesis 6:9, which actually is about Noah, believe it or not. That's one of the few, if maybe the only example of these accounts actually talking about the person whose account it's supposed to be. But we're technically still here in the account of Adam's line. Remember, the original Bibles didn't have chapters and verses or section breaks. When we open up our English Bibles today, we see these nice big numbers, 7, 6, 7, 6, and we see these sections, this white space, which in between the columns, which breaks off the sections, and then we have these black italicized letters that mark section headings. None of that would have been in the original scrolls, the original scriptures. So Genesis divides itself up into its accounts. And we're technically, even though we've entered a new chapter in the English Bible, we're technically still in the written account of Adam's line. So we'll go ahead and finish that for today. And I want to talk about this, and I'll separate this from the rest of the flood story, which we'll do the next time. When men began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them. So we just got done reading about that. Okay, we just got done reading about the account of Adam, from Adam down to Noah. Before that, we read from Cain down to Lamech. Yeah. So we're reading about men increasing in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, now we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, so they survived the flood, whatever Nephilim are. When the sons of God went to the daughters of men, and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals, and creatures that move along the ground, and the birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is the account of Noah. Just a little bit more. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and was full of violence. Every inclination of his thoughts was only evil all the time. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop there. One of the things that, we're not going to get into the rest of the flood account for today. One of the things that makes the flood account difficult, again, is this idea of parallelism, and this is a case where it really stands out, even as you read it in English, because so many of the things are stated twice in this section. In fact, some people will tell you there are two different accounts here that have been smashed together. It's not necessarily impossible, but we are definitely. Yes, Kat? This is so weird. I don't know how it happened, but the camera has been flipped. So, yeah. When I'm looking at the monitor, I don't know anything about this stuff. I just have this one camera here. But when I look up at the monitor, which is recording me, my left is on my right and my right is on my left, so it's confusing. So the cat is down here, but I see her over here, and I look down there, and she's not down there. Where are you, cat? Where did you go? Yeah. Because we do have throughout this section we're going to read many of the same things stated twice. It could be an example of just simple Hebrew parallelism. It could be, as some people would say, that there are two accounts here that have been smashed into one. Maybe count both. Maybe there are two accounts here that have been put together in parallel passages. But for today, I want to talk about the beginning of the story, the setup to the flood itself, the context in which the flood occurs. We'll talk about the flood itself at a later time, and we'll get into all that. But right now, I just want to talk about the beginning, the setup to the flood, the context in which the flood is said to have occurred. Because there's a lot of misunderstanding even about that. There's a lot of misunderstanding about this topic in general, but let's talk today only about this particular area. Because people see this term, sons of God, and their minds just go crazy with imagination about things. They assume, and then with the word Nephilim, this idea, or Nephilim, I don't know how you pronounce it, this idea that, well, there must have been some angel-human hybrid. These sons of God are angels, and they married women and had kids, and there must have been some sort of angel-human hybrid on the face of the planet, which were the Nephilim or whatever. Well, that's just total malarkey. That's just totally made up. Nephilim as a term in Hebrew, first of all, the text says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. And clearly, they survived the flood. Okay, in the text, only 8 people survived the flood. So the Nephilim they were still on the earth even after the flood. So they had to come from somewhere. So if the purpose of the flood was to wipe out the Nephilim, then obviously God failed in his purpose, because the text itself says the Nephilim were on the earth after the flood too. The Nephilim mean the fallen ones. Basically, their purpose in the story is to be defeated. They are, from today's point of view, you could call them the bad guys, or the Saturday morning cartoon villains. Cat. Not a cat who just wants to annoy me. Who are just there to lose at the end. Basically, they're the people that Israel needs to overcome. When they go into the land later on, the days of Moses and Joshua, they're going to run into the Nephilim again there too. And it's not really even like a race, or it's certainly not a category of creature like some angel-human hybrid. It's not even really a race. If you later on, we're going to talk about the Rephaim, or the certain groups of people, like certain tribes of people who make up the Nephilim, and it really means more like a category of these are the fallen ones. Like these are the ones who are in the way, and they have to fall. They have to be defeated. The Israelites have to overcome these people in order to move on. Like they're just in the story to lose, basically. They're there to be defeated by the Israelites, or be defeated by God, working through the Israelites, or in this case Noah. And that's just what they are. Like they're just the enemies, the ones who oppose God, and they're in the story to be defeated. So there's no big secret here. There's no big mystery of Nephilim, like some exotic alien species or whatever. The clue to this passage, and this is actually probably the clue to understanding the early book chapters in Genesis in general, is the end of verse 4, where he says they finish off the talk about the Nephilim by saying they were the heroes of old, men of renown. So the writer here, the author, the person who is writing this down and then going out and reading it in front of the people, is assuming these people know who these heroes are. Okay, so to the author, he's not writing anything exotic or mysterious. He is assuming that his hearers, his audience, his listeners, the people he's actually writing to, know what he's talking about. They know who these heroes are. He's not giving us these heroes' names. He's not telling us who these heroes are. But he is assuming that his readers, his listeners, his hearers, his audience already know. That's a clue that we can use for this entire section and probably the entire part of the early part of Genesis, and that the people that he's speaking to are already familiar with this stuff. They know about these heroes. These men of great renown are renowned. They know they're known about. Okay, the Israelites have heard about these guys. Now we haven't necessarily. Now we have records, ancient records that even date back to Moses' day or before, that talk about early heroes. Gilgamesh, of course, being one. Now Gilgamesh actually came after the flood, but he met a survivor of the flood in his story. And Moses, so that doesn't go back as far as before the flood, although again a character in the story was before the flood. But the idea of there being these ancient heroes was common to the people that the reader, Moses, is speaking to. We today may not know who these heroes are. To us, these heroes may not be renowned. We may have a few examples we've heard about, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, stories that have stood the test of time even after 3,500 or 4,000 years or more. But we don't know all these heroes these people knew about. So the author is assuming that his people he's talking to, know about these men, these heroes. And he's telling them where they came from. One of the things that you'll find interesting if you go back and read whatever copies we have left of these really ancient stories and epics, is that the characters in those stories, like Gilgamesh, are supposed to be heroic, but we would call them today pretty despicable. Okay, like Gilgamesh is not a good guy. Now, part of the purpose of the story is that he gets better. I mean, that is true. To be fair to the author of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is supposed to improve as a character as the story goes along. But today, we would not consider these people to be heroes. The things that they did that made them heroes or made them men of great renown, we would say make them pretty disgusting, despicable guys today. But the standards were different back then, and so these heroes were people who just did great deeds. You know, I talked before, and I mentioned this before. To these people, the way you live forever is to do great deeds so your name lives forever, or have sons, many sons, so your name lives forever. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which I mentioned earlier. In that story, Gilgamesh, the main character, goes on a quest to obtain immortality. He is a king. He's probably Nimrod, a character we'll meet in the Bible a little bit later. But he is a king, and he goes on a quest. He's an evil king. I mean, we call him a hero, a man of great renown, but the things he does as a king are despicable and horrible. And we'll get to that in just a moment. There's more to be said about that, which we'll talk about in just a second here. But he goes on a quest to become immortal, basically, to find the secret to immortality. And in the end, what he does is he goes to seek out a survivor of the flood. I don't know what the name of the story is. You could consider it to be the story's equivalent of Noah. It's actually probably more likely Ham, who is Nimrod's grandfather, if Nimrod and Gilgamesh are the same guy. At any rate, he goes to meet a survivor of the flood, and this survivor of the flood, whether it's Noah or Ham or some other character, whatever equivalent he is, that guy is immortal. He was mortal when he was born, but through the act of being saved from the floodwaters by the gods, he has become immortal. He has obtained immortality. Gilgamesh wants to know from him how to do that too. And he gives him a certain thing he can do, whatever. I forget exactly what it is. Something about so either that or I forget honestly how the story goes. Gilgamesh has a friend called Enkidu who goes along with him for a period of time. I think this is like a puppet made by the gods or something like that. I don't forget. Enkidu dies, and either Gilgamesh is trying to restore him to life, or he's still trying to get immortality. Gilgamesh sets off on a quest to obtain immortality. I do remember that. I forget, and he does meet a survivor of the flood who has obtained immortality and asks him for how to do it. And the survivor gives him some sort of specific challenge, and he's supposed, I forget what it is exactly. He gives him a way to do it. Gilgamesh ends up not succeeding in this challenge, so Gilgamesh does not, accomplish his goal. I forget at this point whether Gilgamesh is still seeking immortality or if he's trying to resurrect his dead friend. I forget that. I can't remember. I can't remember which of that it is. But at any rate, either way, he does not end up passing the test or accomplishing the challenge that the flood survivor gives him. So he does not obtain his goal, either of becoming immortal or resurrecting his friend. I don't. Either way. So he goes home then and decides that the way he's going to become immortal, he cannot live forever. But the way he becomes immortal is if he makes his name great, and his name lives forever. Okay, and this is after the flood. Again, I believe this guy is equivalent to the biblical Nimrod. But that's how the ancient people thought. When God comes to Abraham in Genesis 12 and speaks to him about leave your land and go to the land that I will show you, and I'll make your name great, and I'll make you a blessing, and I'll give you descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sands of the sea. That's how he gets him. He doesn't get him with the promise to resurrect his body and live forever with him someday. At this point in time, God has not told mankind he's going to reestablish their immortality. So he hasn't told them that yet. He won't tell them that for a long time. Even when they go into the land, their promise, their covenant promise, is based on the land. It's not based on the idea that they're going to be resurrected from the dead someday. Now, they'll develop that concept later, and God will start talking about that later. But when Moses goes into the land, and Joshua leads him to the land, Joshua goes into the land, and they settle in the land, there is no hint of the idea that they're doing this for the sake of being resurrected and living forever with God someday. They're doing it to have the land. You won't hear a thing mentioned about resurrection or about living forever in any of the works of Moses anywhere. So, okay, so how does this go back to the flood? All right, so these guys, these men of great renown, okay, had been on the earth in those days, the Nephilim, the fallen ones. They were the heroes of old. These Hebrews, these Israelites that are being spoken to, would have known about these stories. We may not know about these stories today, but these people did. And this guy, this author, is saying that this is where these people came from. They were not great men. They were not great heroes. They were actually evil men. They were wicked, and they were acting wickedly. They were filling the earth with violence. They were acting corruptly. They were coming to women and having sex with them and having kids all over. The sons of God throws us off, that term does, because we think of that being like some angelic group of people or beings. But you have to remember that they called themselves this. In the ancient cultures, the men who claimed dominion over people at this point in time did so on behalf of, on the reason, their rationale for doing it was that they were a son of God. Going all the way back even in Genesis 3, when we were talking about the promise or the curse made on the serpent, and the promise made to Adam and Eve in that curse, that the seed of the woman was going to crush the serpent's head. It's like, I think those guys took that to mean themselves. I think those guys took that to mean that they were going to be the Son of God. If you look at the cultures around that time and throughout most of history, leadership was designated based on your claim to divinity. Either you were a manifest God or you were the son of a god. And you would get enough people together basically to be your priests to enforce your religion, and then that is what made you powerful. When Cain is building his city back in Genesis 4, I don't know exactly if he did it that way, But they name their cities after themselves or their sons, and they establish their authority based on their claims to be the sons of God. So I think that these terms, the sons of God, are simply referring to these men who claim to literally be the sons of God, or the Elohim, or the El Elohim, or exactly however they pronounced it. Their earliest word for God was El. Elohim is a plural form of it. And they could claim this title of divinity, or the son of divinity, for themselves. And I believe that what was happening, so when it talks about the sons of God, or the so-called sons of God, coming to the daughters of men, and having children by them, and filling the earth with violence, and being heroes of old men of renown, I think what it's referring to, and we will actually see examples of this later in Genesis and in the Old Testament, is that these men were claiming authority for themselves based on their claims to divinity, or at least being the son of divinity, and they were helping themselves to whatever woman they saw. It says in Genesis 6, at the beginning of the verse, they saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. And I think what there's really saying there, and kind of maybe a kind way of saying it, is that they were helping themselves to any young women they wanted. And we know this happened later, because we actually have examples of this happening later in Genesis. When Jacob's family are moving around, they come back into the area, they're living around Shechem, and the prince of Shechem decides he likes Jacob's daughter, Dinah. What are you doing, Kat? Go away, go away, go away, go away. So he has sex with her before marriage, and then that makes Simeon and Levi mad, so they concoct a plot to kill all the males in that city. I think that's an example of the sort of thing that Genesis 6 refers to very obliquely in passing here, of leaders, corrupt, wicked leaders, claiming a form of divinity for themselves, to be sons of God, helping themselves pretty much to whatever woman they wanted. And I believe that in the aftermath of that created a cycle of retribution and violence, which is what ultimately ended up filling the earth with violence. Just like Simeon and Levi took it upon themselves to massacre all the males of that city in revenge for their daughter Dinah, I think that this sort of thing would have been, Abraham went down to Egypt, and he was again going around that same area, and twice hid his relationship with his wife and said she was his sister, because he knew the men of that culture would just take her. He knew that Pharaoh would just take Sarah, whatever, and that if Abraham were her husband, he'd just kill Abraham to get her. If Abraham were her brother, he at least wouldn't kill Abraham. And he assumed that would happen. I'm assuming he assumed this because that sort of thing happened. That was not probably an unfounded concern. Now you could say that, and you can say easily, accurately, that he showed a lack of faith in God to take care of him and Sarah in that situation. He also showed a lack of concern for Sarah, his wife, not viewing her as being an essential part of the covenant, which we'll get to that when we get to that. But he probably assumed, his assumption that this would happen was probably justified in the sense that it probably did happen a lot. His son Isaac is going to do the same thing with his wife Rebecca. And so I think that, we'll read other instances in the Old Testament. And of course, this sort of thing happens even to this day. In fact, just last night before I went to bed, I was reading a bunch of articles about, now this happened apparently a month ago in the UK. And I'll admit, my focus in the last several weeks or months has been about COVID. So news stories that aren't about COVID have kind of slipped under my radar to a large degree. Especially if they're foreign, especially if it happens in the UK. And I don't even know how I got onto this. But before I went to bed last night, I found a series of news articles about the disappearance of a young woman about a month ago, in early March in the UK, named Sarah Everard or something like that. And I don't know, I didn't read into it enough to know what was unique about this particular woman's disappearance and why it caused a flurry of articles and tweets and things like that when other young women disappear all the time. I don't know what was special about her that kind of provoked another outcry of violence against women, but it did, at least in the UK. And so I was reading a bunch of articles about that from about a month ago, early March, and some, kind of throughout the month of March. Again, about this idea of, this, I think someone was charged for kidnapping and murdering, and I haven't read the details of this particular story. But I mean, there are lots of examples like this. Like, whether you talk about this particular incident or others, there's innumerable examples just like this one of a guy claiming a woman for himself, basically, regardless of her or anybody else's input, to disastrous consequences. So this pattern, this tendency reflects itself even to this day in our daily society. And you think about how guarded, because one of the, I was reading some of these articles about how men and women view personal safety and security very differently, which is true. But you think about how our society is today and how women still look over their shoulder, or whenever they get into their cars, whenever they go around anywhere, in a way that men tend not to today. And we live in a world of unwalled villages. Maybe we should put walls up around them. I don't know. I'm not a wall guy or whatever. But we go from one village to another, and we don't see any walls. And at this point in time, every town had a wall. Nobody in the ancient world would have lived in a town that didn't have a wall around it. Now, some of it was to protect against wild animals and just threats of nature that also were more rampant back then than they are today. But a lot of it was to keep out invaders, outsiders, hostile forces, or even just random vagabonds that are coming around looking for trouble. And I think that in this context, I think we're talking about people who are claiming divinity for themselves, who are claiming to be God, a manifestation of God, or the Son of God. Remember, all these people would have believed in God at this point in time. The idea of other gods would not have probably came along around then, because when Adam and Eve came along and their son, they would have known God. They would have told their sons and daughters about God. And it would have been probably sometime around here when they were scattered around and building cities and all that they started coming up with the idea of other gods in order to claim divinity for themselves. So I believe that's what's behind this term, sons of God. And I believe it's like that's what they called themselves. So I think the author is using their own term for themselves to mock them. I don't think they were anything of the sort. And I think that when they wanted women, they just took them, basically, which again we'll see actually happen later on in the Bible, and we see happen even today in our culture today. I think when these so-called sons of God wanted women, they just took them. Now there could be instances, I think there probably were plenty of instances where the fathers and brothers of these taken women just let it go. They didn't have the strength and the resources to fight back, and they didn't. But I think there probably were plenty of other instances where the fathers or brothers or even husbands of these other women wanted their women back, or wanted to get justice or revenge for them, and so they took to arms. And that led to a cycle of conflict and violence. I believe that's where the reference to the earth being full of violence comes from. So that is what I believe is a setup in the context for the flood. That the earth is full of violence because of this pattern of retribution, this pattern of taking for themselves, these sons of God claiming divinity for themselves, claiming authority over other men and over women for themselves, and by in the process of claiming this authority for themselves, they seize these women, take them for themselves. This creates the retribution and feedback, at least in some instances, from other men attached to these women, and that leads to constant escalation and violence. And I believe that is the conditions that the earth was in as time reached towards the flood. I don't believe it has anything to do with angels coming down and cohabitating or copulating with humans. I don't actually believe that at all. I don't believe the reference to the Nephilim I don't believe the author thinks he's writing anything mysterious to his audience. He knew the audience knew who he was talking about. He says these are the heroes of old, men of renown. You've heard these guys. You know who these people are. You've heard the stories of these people. This is where they came from. They weren't the heroes or the great guys you thought they were, or they tried to claim to be. They were actually bad guys. They were actually full of violence and corrupt, and they needed to be wiped out. So that's why that happened. I think that is what is being said here. Unlike, for example, the story with the serpent talking in Genesis 3, or the long lifespans in Genesis 5, and even afterwards. And both of those are things I think the author knew his audience would be questioning and just didn't answer their questions. I think in this case, he's assuming his audience knows who these heroes are, who these sons of God are, who these Nephilim are. And he is not answering their questions because he assumes they already know. He's just telling them this is where they actually came from. They were not great men. They were not these heroes of old, these men of renown that you've heard about, were actually evil men who took for themselves whatever they wanted and filled the earth with violence and had to be wiped out. I also don't necessarily think the other common interpretation of this passage is that this is referring to the holy men of Adam's line, the sons of God, marrying the unholy women of Cain's line, the daughters of men. I don't really think that's it either. That there could be an element of that. The idea of intermarriage with a corrupt bloodline or whatever could be a part of that too. There could be an element of that, but I personally don't believe that is the main meaning of this passage, because I don't see, and the reason I don't see how that alone would lead to an earth that is corrupt or full of violence. Now, we did read about Cain killing Abel, and we read about Lamech killing somebody and then vowing retribution on anybody who would take revenge against him. So there is the idea of escalation and conflict within the line of Cain. But I don't really see how the daughters, the women of Cain's line, marrying the men of Seth's line, I don't see how that comes together to create an earth that's full of violence. Maybe some corruption. You could define corruption in that way, but that doesn't necessarily lead me to understand how we get to an earth that's full of violence. The earth being full of violence, I think, is easier to explain in the sense that this violence itself was a result of the taking of the daughters of men by the sons of God. And not in the sense that angels were inhabiting the bodies of humans or whatever and mating with human women and creating this half species, nothing like that, but that men who claimed to be the sons of God were seizing and taking daughters, women for themselves, having kids by them, married any of them they chose, having kids by them. And then that would in turn create violence and retribution. And that matches up with history. We see examples of this even later in Genesis. And we also have other examples. I talked about Gilgamesh earlier. Gilgamesh did that. One of the things about Gilgamesh as a king is that he took women. He took the women of his city, whenever woman he wanted. He claimed and he helped himself to them. So that idea of these dominant rulers, again, that happens today. We see this pattern, this nature, this aspect of sinful humanity, sinful manhood in particular, still acting out this way to this day. It still happens. So to me, that scenario then is easier to envision happening between, during the years of Adam or Seth, I guess, down to Noah. It's easier for me to see that happening than simply intermarriage between the godly line and the ungodly line. First of all, I'm not really clear that the line of Cain itself is all that ungodly. You could make a case that the contrast between it and the line of Seth is supposed to point that out, which I said earlier. Parallelism in Hebrew writing is an important concept to keep aware of. So there could be some truth to that, but nothing except for Cain's own murder of Abel and the building of the city. Nothing after that indicates that the men in between him and Lamech, who also was a murderer, all had to be evil. Some of these guys built harps and flutes, like we read about. Well, David was a harpist and a flute player, so does that mean David's evil because he's playing evil instruments? Does that mean instruments are evil? It's like, well, David played instruments and he wrote psalms with instructions telling people when to use instruments, what kind of instruments to use. I don't think that we're getting any condemnation of instruments here just because it came from the line of Cain, or tools, or woodworking, or things like that. And so, actually, let's be specific about what they did. Harp and flute, father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. Abel himself had been said earlier he kept flocks. I guess he didn't necessarily raise livestock. And then making tools out of bronze. So those are some of the things that Cain's line did. Are we supposed to assume that all of those men were evil and that all their works were evil? I don't think so. I don't necessarily get that meaning out of the text. Maybe that's in there. Does that also mean that all of Seth's line were holy? I don't know if we can necessarily say that either. Now, these are the men who'd be in the line of leading up to Jesus. But, we're going to have some kings who are going to be part of that line leading up to Jesus who were not good. So, I don't think we necessarily assume that every single male member of the line leading up to Jesus was a good guy, but, just by virtue of being in the line. Like I said, we're going to have some stories of some of the kings in that line who weren't good guys. So, I don't know. I don't really see a justification for the thinking that the sons of God, many daughters of men, has to refer to the men of Seth's line marrying the women of Cain's line. I think I don't see the text really justifying that, and I have a hard time understanding then how that leads to the earth being full of violence. So. And again, I don't believe the Nephilim were angels or the sons of God. Sons of God is a term that is used of angels, okay? But like I said, this term can also be used of men, especially if we're referring to the term these men themselves use to refer to themselves. If the author is using these men's own words to describe themselves as a way to describe them here, I could see that easily applying to these men. And I think that it's easier then to see how we get to a situation where the earth is full of violence and corrupt and God is ready to destroy it all because of that. Okay, I've been talking a long time on this. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This video's been going on for almost 40 minutes. I've already read, this is the end of a long day of reading. I can only do so much of this at a time before my voice begins to give out, and I'm definitely feeling it getting kind of scratchy down here, so I am done for the day, and we will pick back up with the rest of the flood next time, and we will discuss. I'm not going to get into geology. I'm not going to get into the science. I'm just not going to get into that. I'll say a few things about it, but we're going to talk about the text as it appears in our Bibles. We're going to talk about how it makes sense in the story of the Israelites, which is the context that we need to actually make it make sense and fit into. That's the context it was written in. How the original audience would have heard it, and how to hear it like they heard it, and how it speaks to judgment. God's judgment on the earth today. We often wonder, why doesn't God just deal with all these people? All these wicked people, all these bad things happening. Why doesn't God just do something about it? Well, you know what? There was a time when he actually did do something about it, and that something was wiping out everybody. If we're going to ask God to just deal with all the bad people, you know what that means? It means he's going to have to wipe everybody out, including you and me. So that's one of the things we're going to be talking about, but we'll do that. We'll do it next time.